The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Sylvie Marchand would later think was fitting. Tuesdays had always been the worst day of the week, even when she was small. She was elbow-deep in the kitchen basin, washing the breakfast plates, when her father came in from the yard with the envelope already opened. That was the first sign something was wrong. Emmett Marchand never opened letters at the gate. He saved them for the kitchen table, where the light was good and he could read slowly, the way he did everything. He set the envelope down without a word and pulled out the chair across from her. Sylvie dried her hands on her apron and looked at him. His face had gone the color of old ash.
"Pass," she said. He didn't answer right away. He pressed his palm flat against the table, like he needed something solid under him. Outside, a crow called once and then was quiet. $3,200, he said finally. That's what I owe Callum Prest by the end of the month. She sat down slowly. The chair scraped against the floor. Her father had borrowed the money 2 years before, when the spring floods took out the north fence and half the herd with it.
He'd borrowed from Callum Prest because the bank in Drumheller had already said no twice, and Prest had been willing.
Too willing, she understood now.
And the interest had been climbing ever since, quiet and steady as water rising in a basement.
"What happens if we can't pay?" she asked.
Emmett looked at the table.
"He takes the land."
The Marchand homestead was 40 acres of short-grass prairie east of the Red Deer River, in the Alberta foothills. It had been her grandfather's first, and then her father's, and it smelled like sage and dry wood and horse, and Sylvie had never once in 26 years imagined living anywhere else. She thought about that for a moment. Then she asked the question she already knew the answer to.
"Do we have $3,200?
Her father shook his head. That evening, a truck came up the drive. Sylvie was on the porch, and she watched it come. A dark blue Ford, older model, moving slow and deliberate down the dirt track like it had all the time in the world. She didn't recognize it at first. It was only when the door opened and the man stepped out that something in her chest went tight.
Rhett Deveraux. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe she'd just forgotten.
She hadn't seen him in 4 years, not since his father's funeral, when he'd stood at the back of the church in a gray suit that didn't quite fit and hadn't spoken to anyone. He'd left Drumheller 2 weeks after that and gone north to manage his uncle's cattle operation up near Grande Prairie, and people in town had mostly stopped talking about him after the first year. He took his hat off when he reached the porch steps.
His hair was darker than she remembered, threaded with a little gray at the temples now. He was 38. "Miss Marchand," he said. "Deveraux."
She didn't move from the doorframe.
"What are you doing here?" "I heard about your father's situation," he said.
"I'd like to speak with him if he's in." She wanted to ask how he'd heard and from whom, and what exactly he thought he was going to say. But her father's voice came from inside before she could speak, calling out that whoever it was should come in. The screen door stuck if you didn't lift it. Rhett looked at her. She stepped aside. She stood in the kitchen doorway while the two men talked. She didn't sit. She watched Rhett Deveraux set his hat on the table and speak quietly to her father for a long time. And she watched her father's face go through things she couldn't quite name, surprise and something like relief, and then a kind of uncomfortable gratitude that made him look smaller than he was.
What Rhett proposed was simple, on the surface of it. He would pay Callum Prest directly, the full $3,200, cleared by the end of the week.
In exchange, Sylvie would come to work at his property, the Deveraux Ranch, 30 kilometers north, which he'd inherited from his father and only recently returned to manage, as his housekeeper and cook for a term of 1 year. No wages beyond room and board. At the end of the year, the debt would be considered settled. Her father looked at her when Rhett finished speaking. Sylvie looked at the wall behind Rhett's head. "That's not a fair exchange," she said. "A year of unpaid labor for $3,200. That's less than minimum wage." "It is," Rhett agreed without flinching. "You're right. So I'll add this. At the end of the year, if you decide you want to leave, the debt is still cleared. No further obligation. And if at any point you want to leave before the year is up, I won't stop you. The debt remains cleared regardless." She looked at him then. He was watching her steadily. He had a way of holding still that she'd always found slightly unnerving. Not cold, exactly, but contained. Like a man who'd learned a long time ago to keep most of himself back. "Why?" she asked. "Because I knew your grandfather," he said, "and I don't want to see this land go to Callum Prest." It wasn't the whole truth. She didn't know that yet. She went to the Deveraux Ranch on a Saturday morning in early April, with 2 bags and the cast-iron pan her mother had left her, and absolutely no idea what she was walking into. The house was older than she'd expected. A 2-story wood frame that had been added onto in pieces over 3 or 4 generations, so that it didn't quite make sense from any angle but felt solid in a way that newer houses didn't. The kitchen was large and south-facing. The back window looked out over the open range, and in the early morning the light came in sideways and turned everything amber. Rhett showed her the house with the careful efficiency of a man who lived alone and had organized his space for exactly that purpose.
He explained where things were, what time the ranch hands came in for meals, what needed doing each day. He was polite, he was not unfriendly, but he kept a distance that she couldn't quite measure, not cold enough to be rude, not warm enough to be comfortable. The first week was the strangest of her life.
She cooked for Rhett and two ranch hands, Skeeter and Old Earl, who ate everything she put in front of them without complaint, and scraped their plates and said, "Thank you, ma'am," with the kind of automatic prairie courtesy that she'd grown up around. She cleaned. She learned which floorboards creaked and which cupboards jammed and where the hot water ran slow in the morning. She found a box of her father's letters in the back shed, dated 15 years ago, addressed to Rhett's father, and realized the two men had known each other longer and more closely than she'd understood. She and Rhett ate breakfast at the same table, but rarely at the same time. She was usually done before he came in from the morning check. She'd leave a plate covered with a cloth and hear him come in when she was already in the back garden or the laundry room, and she told herself this arrangement suited her fine.
It mostly did. It was Skeeter who told her, without meaning to, in the second week.
He was working a fence line near the house, and she brought him coffee, and they stood in the cold spring sun for a few minutes, talking about nothing in particular, the weather, the price of hay, whether the creek would run high this year.
And then Skeeter said,
in the way of a man who assumes everyone already knows a thing,
"Must be strange for you, being back here. Rhett always talked about you like you were part of the place somehow." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" Skeeter seemed to realize he'd said something he shouldn't have.
He turned the coffee mug in his hands.
"Well," he said carefully, "he grew up knowing your family, that's all I meant." But that wasn't all he meant, and she knew it.
She turned it over in her mind for the next several days, trying to make it mean nothing. She'd been a child when Rhett Deveraux was already a young man. He was 12 years older than her. He'd left Drumheller when she was 22 and hadn't come back except for the funeral. There was no version of that story that made sense the way Skeeter's words implied, and yet she started to notice things.
The way he'd set up the south kitchen specifically, she later learned.
Because the original plan had called for a north-facing utility room, and he'd had it changed. The way there were books on the shelf that she wouldn't have expected, two of them, she realized with a small jolt, were ones she'd mentioned offhand at her father's kitchen table years ago, in a conversation she barely remembered. The way he asked, once quietly over supper, whether the altitude bothered her. She'd mentioned once, years ago at someone else's dinner party, that she sometimes got headaches at elevation. She didn't say anything, she wasn't ready to. The trouble with Callum Prest arrived in June. He came to the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon, and Sylvie was the one who answered the door, because Rhett was out on the North Range and wouldn't be back until evening. Prest was a heavy-set man in his late 50s with small eyes, and a way of looking at a room like he was already calculating what it was worth. He'd been running the local lending operation in Drumheller for 20 years, and people borrowed from him when they had no other choice and spent the next several years regretting it. He looked at Sylvie for a long moment. Then he smiled, and she didn't like the shape of it. "Miss Marchand," he said.
"I heard you'd landed here. Interesting arrangement. Mr. Deveraux isn't in," she said. "I'll let him know you called." "Oh, I'm not here for Deveraux."
He leaned against the door frame with the ease of a man who'd never been turned away anywhere. "I'm here because I want you to understand something."
"The debt your father owed me. Deveraux paid it, yes, but the original agreement had a clause.
Refinancing voids certain protections. I've been speaking with my lawyer. There may be grounds to revisit the terms." She looked at him steadily.
"You should talk to Rhett about that." "I'm talking to you," he said, "because you're the one who has something to lose if this gets complicated. Your father's land is still in your father's name, and your father is 63 years old with a bad hip and no sons." He paused.
"I'm just saying, it might be worth your while to think about where your loyalties best serve you." After he left, she stood in the kitchen for a long time. The late afternoon light was coming in low and flat, and it lay in yellow bars across the wooden floor, and she watched the dust move in it and thought about what Callum Prest had just told her to do without quite saying it.
When Rhett came in that evening, she told him everything, word for word, without editorializing.
She had a good memory for conversations, and she laid it out cleanly. He listened without interrupting.
When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry he came here. That shouldn't have happened."
"What did the clause say?" she asked. "In the original agreement?" He looked at her for a long moment.
"It said that if the debt was paid by a third party,
Prest retains the right to renegotiate the interest terms on any related property within 5 years, which means he can still come for my father's land." "He's going to try," Rhett said.
"But I have a lawyer too, and I've been working on this since April." She sat down at the table. Since April, she repeated. Since before I got here. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. Rhett, she said, why did you really do this?
He pulled out the chair across from her, the same way her father had sat down with the envelope in his hand 3 months before, and she had the odd sensation of the scene completing itself.
Because 11 years ago, he said, you were 15 years old, and your horse threw you on the South Road, and I was the one who found you. You were sitting in the ditch with a bloody knee, reading a book you'd had in your saddlebag. You looked up at me and you said, don't make a fuss, I'm fine, and then you asked me if I'd ever read it.
He stopped. I had, and I don't know exactly what that was or what to do with it, but I've been thinking about it since.
She stared at him. You remembered that, she said.
I remembered everything, he said simply. She didn't know what to do with that for a while. She went to bed that night and lay awake for a long time, looking at the ceiling, listening to the wind come off the open range. She thought about being 15 and sitting in a ditch, and the particular feeling of someone looking at her like she was a whole person, not a girl in trouble, not a problem to be solved. She thought about what it meant that he'd held that all these years without saying a word, without expecting anything. She thought about Callum Prest and the clause, and the lawyer Rhett had already hired in April. She thought about the south-facing kitchen. The legal challenge took most of the summer. Rhett's lawyer was a woman named Constance, out of Red Deer, who was approximately 5 feet tall and had the methodical precision of a person who had never lost an argument she'd prepared for. Sylvie drove to Red Deer twice to give her own account of Prest's visit, and Constance asked her questions with a directness she found bracing and almost pleasant. In August, the challenge failed. Prest had overreached. The clause, Constance explained, applied only to the property used as original collateral, which had been a piece of commercial land Emmett no longer owned. The homestead was clean. The homestead was safe. Sylvie was in the kitchen when Rhett came home with the news. She was flouring the counter for biscuits, and he came in and told her, and she put down the rolling pin and sat on the floor right there, because her knees had simply stopped working. He sat down beside her, against the base of the kitchen cabinets, on the flour-dusted wooden floor. He didn't say anything.
He just sat there. After a while she said, thank you.
You don't have to thank me. I know, she said.
I'm thanking you anyway. They stayed like that for a while, and the light came in through the south window and lay warm across the floor, and outside the range was green and still, and neither of them said anything else for a long time. She did not leave at the end of the year.
She stayed through the winter, which in the Alberta foothills came early and hard, and transformed the whole landscape into something beautiful and severe.
She stayed through the first real snowfall,
when the range disappeared into white, and the horses stood steaming in the yard, and Earl fell on the ice and swore magnificently in 3 languages, and she stayed through Christmas, when her father drove up from Drumheller and sat at the kitchen table and ate too much and fell asleep in the good chair and snored softly while Rhett read and she did the dishes and the fire went low. She stayed because she wanted to. That was the whole of it. Simple as that, and stranger than anything. It was February when she finally said the thing out loud. They were walking the fence line in the early morning, checking for ice damage after a hard freeze. The ground was iron under their boots, and the sky was pale and enormous, and their breath made small clouds in the cold air. She had been thinking about it for weeks. She had been turning it over and looking at it from different angles, the way you do with a thing you're not quite ready to say.
I don't want to leave, she told him. Rhett kept walking for a few steps. Then he stopped.
He turned and looked at her, and in the early light his face was open in a way she didn't see often, careful and hoping at the same time.
Then don't, he said. It wasn't a declaration, it wasn't a speech. It was Rhett Deveraux in 6 letters,
and she found that she understood it completely. She thought about the girl in the ditch on the South Road. She thought about the south-facing kitchen, and the books on the shelf, and the lawyer hired in April before she'd even arrived. She thought about 11 years of quiet, and what it meant to be known by someone who never once asked you to be anything other than exactly what you were.
Okay, she said.
The February sun came up slow over the open range, pale gold and wide, and they walked back to the house together in the cold, clear air, and the land stretched out around them, flat and enormous in theirs.